Well, this is one of the Dellorto carburetors from the Morini Riders Club club bike, and because it's an early bike, it has a VHB carburetor, whereas the later bikes have a VHB-Z. And as far as I know, the only difference between them, and I have a late VHB-Z here, I can tell it's a late one because it's got a plastic top cap rather than a cast metal one, is that this one plugs into a rubber manifold and this one plugs on to a metal manifold. So you can see this one's got the slots and uses a compression clamp, and it has a different insert, and apart from that the carburetors are pretty much identical. And the kits, the seal kits fit both carburetors, and there are you'll find you'll get spares in this kit. You won't use every component in here. There's an O-ring in there that I've don't know the purpose of, certainly on Morini's, and the top cover gasket. There's two of them because there are two body sizes in the range. I think when you get to a 27 it steps up to a larger body, but in any case this has been through the ultrasonic cleaning tank and we're ready to put it back together. And we'll start off with what's described by Dellorto as the atomizer, or you describe it as an emulsion tube. And this thing has a pattern of holes on it. Holes at the bottom let in fuel, holes at the top or towards the top let in air, and the level of fuel in the carburetor varies under acceleration. So depending on the pattern of holes you get enrichment under acceleration. Its effect is quite complex and tends to affect acceleration and mid-range throttle, and getting these right can be a bit tricky. This one is the only one that's now within the Morini range that's available is 260K. Fortunately the two types we tend to work, the D and the BD, can be made, which are not available, can be made by adding the extra holes. Generally speaking, I change the Ks to the other types, but we'll see how the bike runs, because every bike's an individual to a certain extent, and it may run absolutely fine on these. If it was a sport it probably wouldn't. They did fit different versions in different markets for emission reasons. So the first thing we'll do is fit the atomizer, and that just screws in. And then it just needs to be nipped. They're often over-tightened and can be a real pain to get out. There's no need for them to be silly tightened. I'm not even applying anything like a full grip on there. Oh yes, there is another difference I've remembered between the VHB and the VHB-Zs, and that is that the seat for the fuel needle valve is pressed into the carburetor body, and the assembly is replaceable on the VHB-Zs, but the seat and needle look good in here, and it wasn't leaking fuel when the bike arrived, so we'll leave that alone. The idle jet goes in there. Nip that up. Good fitting screwdriver. Okay, we'll come to a slightly more controversial item. This is the starter jet assembly, which has its own kind of emulsion tube arrangement, and this fits into this extension here and has an O-ring on it, and that O-ring plugs into that hole, and there's a horizontal passage leading over to this hole. Now that passage is right down the bottom of the float bowl, is submerged at all times. Some people will tell you that that O-ring is absolutely essential to good starting, and that they've had a bike that was reluctant to start and they've taken the carburetor apart and they've fitted a new O-ring and it's starting again, starting easily again. I simply don't believe it. I've run them without that O-ring entirely and it makes no difference at all. I suspect that any effect is simply from the fact that the jet has been removed and any debris blocking the passages has therefore come out. All that O-ring really does is it makes the jet a tight fit in the float bowl, and it holds the float bowl on whilst you're fitting the main jet and holder. So I say I've run them completely without that, and I've even, just to prove it, I've run them, had a bike working well without with the O-ring, which I've then taken the O-ring out to prove that it made no difference. But I will change the O-ring on this one, and a set of hook tools is handy for getting O-rings off, but this one's so old that it's completely hard and has crumbled. And let's move things out the way just a little bit and we'll delve into the kit. And we'll just briefly go through all the O-rings. The large O-ring is this float bowl seal, and if the float bowl was sealing and not giving any trouble and the seal feels good, I don't change them. Trying to get the O-ring to conform to the groove can be tricky. Actually getting it to stay there while you're fitting the float bowl can be nigh on impossible sometimes. So I tend not to change them if the seal was doing its job. Obviously if it's leaking, I fit a seal. This is the O-ring that has no application on a Morini. This little tiny section, one that often hides itself inside that fibre washer, is this one, which is also part of the starting circuit. This is in fact your starter. You pull it up and it unseals the top end of the starter jet, and also it allows air to run through that passage in there, which I'm putting the pick into. So that's where the starter jet goes, and the mixture then exits via this hole, and it's bypassing the slide. So that's allowing air past the slide when the throttle is shut, so that gives you your fast idle and gives you additional fuel for a rich mixture for starting. So although you'll call it a choke, technically it's not, because a choke actually causes enrichment by blocking off part of the air passage. So the O-ring, well, we've got the three little O-rings, and quite often, even on bikes that haven't been touched, a couple of these O-rings aren't fitted. the biggest one of the three goes on the idle stop. The smallest one goes on the idle jet and is a moderately snug fit. In fact, let's I like to use a little bit of this liner lube because it's compatible with rubber. Though these should be fuel proof O-rings, of course. It'd be rather silly if they weren't, though you can never tell with modern fuel. There we go. I often find these not fitted. The bike seems to run equally well with or without them, but it does hold the spring in place, which is convenient. And then we have this final O-ring, and it is this middle one. Quite a lot of people try and put that one on here, and then wonder why it's such a pain to get into the get the float bowl on. But if you look at the size of the jet, let's come up close to the camera, and you look at the size of the O-ring, you'll see why some people think that getting that O-ring on is an impossibility, and it is tricky, and it does require some lubrication and also to warm the O-ring up. And let's see if we can get this on. Align the slot in the head so that it's in line with the hole in the O-ring. If you've got it any other position, you're likely to tear the O-ring on the edges of the slot. And we'll just ease across the top, and we got him. And that's how you actually get that O-ring in place without splitting it, and it should now be a slip fit into that passage in the float bowl, which will hold the float bowl onto the bottom of the carburetor. So we can fit that starter jet. And we can fit the idle jet. And we'll screw this all the way in until it bottoms, and then out 1.5 turns makes a reasonable starting point. So I've just got a little bit of corrosion to clean off the starter assembly here, just from where I didn't get it completely dry after it coming out of the ultrasonic cleaning tank. And we'll pick that O-ring out. Give that slot a wipe out. And we'll fit the new O-ring. And this one's an easy one. This one just rolls straight in. So that just eases into the top of the carb like so. And these choke assemblies also come in a cable operated version, and some later Morinis in particular had a cable operated starter mechanism. Again, not over tightening, and we'll put the idle stop in. Flick the choke off so it's not sticking up in our way, and I'll just put a little bit of lube onto the rod there, so that that's moving nice and freely. So then we've got the float needle and the float assembly, and though this is an early style float, it seemed to be working fine. We won't disturb it. The little rubber tip on the valve appears to be fine, and it's best to put the little valve onto the float, lower it down, and then you just have your pivot rod, and the pivot rod is knurled at this end, and ideally is a very light press fit into the bracket. They're often they don't actually press in, which can be a little bit of pain handling the carburettor because it can sometimes fall out and you drop the float on the floor. But the float bowl will actually hold that on. So now the float bowl pushes on. Remember, we've got the O-ring there onto the starter jet. And then we've got the main jet, which goes into the main jet holder. And again, just nipped, not over tightened, and that seals with a fibre washer, and it acts also as the float bowl holder. And again, no over tightening, it's virtually a couple of fingers down that sort of level, and look that the gap is even, and you know, you haven't got the O-ring, particularly if it's a new O-ring which doesn't want to stay in place. You really want to make sure that gap's even, or you will be leaking fuel. Okay, so there's the fuel strainer. It's not really a filter, but it is a strainer, and you will find that they fill up with debris, and that sits behind the fuel banjos. I haven't cleaned these yet. That fibre washer is the seal for the banjo, and we will put it onto the banjo bolt and put it in there for safekeeping. So now we've got the top cover gaskets, and you can see the different body sizes. And these generally fit better one way round than the other. Just ease them in. The screws are have a reduced shank, and the top is actually threaded so they're captive, but when they're all the way through they're loose. So you've got the slide and the needle, and you can see there's a fair amount of wear on this slide, and that's one of the reasons they converted to the the rubber manifold was to reduce the vibration on the carburettor and the wear on the slide. This one's not too bad. With a worn slide, you generally find that it's more difficult to get a reliable idle, and you have to push the idle speed up a bit. A tapered needle, which should be in the middle groove. These are not amels. You don't do the main tuning by moving the needles up and down. I've never had to move the needle to anything other than a standard position. You can see there's a little bit of corrosion on the needle, and that's from the bike sitting with the throttle shut and a little bit of moisture getting in. They're not bad enough that I'd want to replace them. The needles are a relatively expensive item. If you are planning to lay a bike up and you don't have a really nice dry storage facility, then the thing to do is to pull the throttle cable out on the twist grip and stick a wedge behind the cable so that the slide is held open slightly, so that there's a separation between the needle and the top of the atomizer, which you can see in there. Now, it's quite easy to get these slides in the wrong way round. They will fit both ways. However, fitting one the wrong way round, should you get the engine started, results in an engine racing away at sort of 6,000–7,000 RPM, which is not good. The easy way of thinking about it is, if it's the engine side, you've got the fully closed side, not the open side. And in fact, if you look on the other side, the slide's fully home and there's a gap at the bottom, whereas the correct way round, with the idle screw backed out, it's absolutely all the way shut. And I can take this opportunity to wind the screw in to just barely crack the slide open. So that's the side of the slide that's got the slot for the throttle cable, the right way around. Also, the top of the slide is angled and the spring is angled to press this flat side to the back of the carburettor. So this side to this face. So that's another way of identifying which way round everything goes. And then I usually just put a couple of turns on everything to hold in place. And that's a carburettor reassembled and ready to go back on the engine. Couple of fibre washers that aren't required in this application, and you get a couple of boots for the throttle cable, and there would be a boot for the remote enrichment cable, so fitted. The boots on the throttle cables often rot off, so having some spares is usually handy. And we're now all ready to start putting things back together.